I want to thank all the NTA teams and of course particularly the Agenda project for the wonderful data that I will be presenting and analyzing, and I'd like to thank Andy Mason and Gretchen Dunauer, who's here, for their help with this project. I'm going to be, well, the NTA data can be used for many, many different kinds of analyses and to enlighten many aspects of policy and academic research. I'm just going to be talking about one piece of this, which is the way changing population age distributions affect the macroeconomy. And I'm going to be addressing this at a fairly, using NTA data, but at a fairly abstract level. In a sense, I'm asking if governments and individuals can solve all the difficult problems of adjusting to longer life and higher proportion of elderly and so on by balancing budgets, raising taxes, cutting benefits, working, whatever. What are we left with after all that? How will these fundamental demographic changes, how will they be affecting the level of consumption in economies around the world? It's not to say that all the solving all the problems of particular institutions and policies and so on aren't extremely important. But this is a kind of meta problem from a step farther back. So we know that population age distributions are changing in developing countries as fertility declines and they move through the demographic transition and the share of the population in the labor force grows, and there's the so-called demographic dividend. We also know that in richer industrial countries and in now many middle-income countries as well, population aging is occurring. We're either partway through it, as in European countries, or at very early stages, as in some parts of East Asia and so on. Both of these, of course, have important macroeconomic impacts. And then in addition, there are age distribution changes that come from baby booms and baby busts, fluctuations such as we had a particularly big one in the United States. And I'm going to be trying to address all of these in a simple but unified economic framework. So the support ratio here is the workhorse concept in this area, the workhorse measure. It's the ratio of what we call effective workers to effective consumers. I'm going to be presenting some results for that, but mostly what I want to do is keep the ingredients of that measure, but add to those capital accumulation and setting aside a portion of output for savings, and see how that affects the results. So, for those of you in NTA, of course, you're very familiar with this, but let me just give a little introduction. So the starting point for NTA is the age profiles, and these are averages across the whole population by age, combining in standard NTA, combining male and female behaviors and outcomes. And so there are 4 of these behaviors for which I will be using the profiles today. The first is consumption, and in NTA that includes private consumption expenditures that are taken from household expenditure surveys and imputed to individuals in the household and so on. And then it also includes public in-kind transfers such as public education or publicly provided health care, which to receive them is to consume them, but it doesn't include pension income because you can do anything you like with pension income. You don't have to consume it. So that's consumption. And labor income includes wages and salaries and fringe benefits before tax, 2/3 of self-employment income, and it also includes zeros for people who don't have any labor income. Simply average those at each age. And then asset income includes interests and dividends, a rental value of a home that is owned, 1/3 of self-employment income, and then other property income. Saving includes public and private saving, although at times here I'll be using just private, with corporate savings allocated to asset owners by age. And then all of these age profiles typically are divided by labor income at ages 30 to 49 to make it easy to compare them across countries, compare them visually. Okay. Now, this is national, I'm going to be using national transfer accounts data, but I haven't said anything about transfers in what I just said. One might wonder, where are they here? Well, they are included implicitly in this analysis because it's transfers that make it possible for age patterns of consumption to diverge from age profiles of income from assets, labor income, minus savings. So that's public pensions, publicly provided health care, public education, whatever parents give their kids when they raise them, and so on and so forth. So those are there, but they're not named. Okay, so here are these profiles for a number of sort of selected countries. They vary a lot in their shape, and of course there's too much detail to absorb, but let's look briefly at some of these. So this is just looking at labor income, the dark orange. So here's labor income in Sweden. Here it is in Japan. And you can see it sort of scrunched to the right in the Japan data, reflecting the emphasis on seniority in labor compensation in Japan. Here we have Senegal. You can see how strong child labor is in Senegal compared to these rich industrial countries or compared to China. And you can also see how much people are working at older ages in Senegal. And then China, you see the labor income scrunched to the left with a peak here, maybe in the late 20s, something like that. This pattern is something you see in countries with exceptionally rapid economic growth and exceptionally rapid increase in educational attainment. So particularly, I think, in East Asia, I think Vietnam would look something like this as well, for example. It poses a problem for what I'm going to do because I want to assume that the shapes of these age profiles are going to stay the same for a while, whereas in China, that simply wouldn't be true. For many of these countries, if you look at historical age profiles, you see that in fact they are quite similar over time. So mostly I'm not going to be showing results for China because of the importance of this rapid transitional stage. Consumption, the blue line here. Well, in Thailand, say a developing country, consumption by age is fairly flat across old age years, maybe declining slightly. That's quite typical for developing countries. Often in low-income countries, it would be declining a bit more. But in many rich industrial countries, it looks more like this. This is US, and you see it's rising very strongly with age. That's a relatively recent development, say in the last 40 years or so, 40 or 50 years. It would be true of a number of countries in Europe, but not all countries in Europe by any means. And of course that makes population aging more costly when the elderly are consuming relatively more. What about asset income? Well, Costa Rica here, you see a very robust asset income, that's the gray line, and it reaches almost 100% of prime age labor income at older ages. But if you compare that, say, to Hungary, you see much lower peak at around 20% of labor income. And in old age, it's very close to zero. Robert Gall could explain why that is, but in any event, it's a very distinctive difference, and it's going to mean that there's a distinctive response to population aging in these two countries. Germany, there's a regular age gradient to to asset income, but it ends up at less than 40% of peak labor income in terms of its value per year. I'm reading off this left scale. And then Japan, something like Germany, I suppose. It gets up, however, to maybe 50–60%, and then there's a fall off. So as populations age, if these patterns of asset ownership remain similar, there are going to be quite big differences in how the stock of assets and stock of capital are affected by population aging. And you can also see big variations in savings rates by age here, with Costa Rica, again, particularly striking. Okay. So the ingredients for what I'm going to be doing are coming from these constructs of effective labor, effective consumers, effective assets. Effective labor is just what labor income would be if the baseline age profile remained the same while population age distribution varied. We multiply the population age distribution times the age profile of labor income and add it up, and that gives us effective workers. I'm going to think of these baseline age profiles as describing something like labor supply and efficiency units per age. And similarly for consumption, we can calculate effective consumers by multiplying population age distribution times those consumption age profiles and adding them up. And similarly for assets. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And what we get from that is capital L, which is effective labor, capital N, effective consumers, and K, effective assets. The support ratio, which I mentioned earlier, is the ratio of effective workers to effective consumers. And this is used a lot in NTA, but also in many articles on economic consequences of population aging. And I'll be using it as a kind of benchmark for comparison later. Okay, so the basic strategy of what I'm going to do is to assume that the level, but not the shape of age profiles changes over time in each country. So I'm assuming that the shape is consistent over time, and that's why I don't think it's really an appropriate approach for a country like China, in which the age profiles are so strongly affected by what is clearly a somewhat temporary economic situation of extremely rapid economic growth and educational expansion. What I'm going to give is not predictions of the future. We know that, in fact, these age profiles will be changing. There'll be changes in pension policy and in individual behavior. In fact, retirement ages are already rising across the OECD countries, for example. But this will tell us something about what would happen if we had the economic behavior we have now, with some adjustments in the future, but mainly what would happen if we had the age profiles now, or the shapes of the age profiles we have now, but changing population age distributions. So we're trying to isolate a direct demographic impact. Okay. Now, let me just say a word about the capital here. Let's see, can I blank this? No. Okay. Let's see. There. Okay. So, a standard way in economics to build up asset holdings or capital holdings by age would be to do this over the life cycle, to track a cohort longitudinally, see what they're saving at each age, see what their income is at each age, and then have something about the rate of return to capital, and you keep accumulating this, and then you end up at each age with some stock of assets. And it would be possible to do something like that here, except you would need deeper historical NTA data, which is sometimes available. But in addition to savings, there's also inheritance that shapes the pattern of assets by age. There's also changing asset value, appreciation, rising house prices of housing, and so on. If you own housing, that will affect the value of the assets you hold at a given age, and so on. So it's quite complicated, and it's certainly complicated if you try to explain the way demography affects savings rates, because they're just many, many different channels of influence. So what I'm going to do is a kind of non-standard approach. I don't think there are any really terrific approaches to modeling saving and asset accumulation, but I'm going to use the actual asset holdings, or infer asset holdings from asset income in NTA data, and use that to model how asset holdings will change as population age distribution changes. Now, of course, these changes must come from savings behavior initially, but they reflect, these patterns of asset ownership reflect many other aspects of the economy, from the structure of public transfers to cultural values and so on. And to show something about how stable, I'd say surprisingly stable, these patterns are, we can look at the US with data from 1981, so this is over a 32-year period. These are asset income age profiles. This is just the age shape. They've been standardized for level, but you can see they're very much the same shape over time, despite the fact that these different generations experience different, booms and busts at different ages, and rates of inflation, and so on and so forth. There's a great deal of stability in these patterns. So this is NTA data, and then here we have more direct measurement of net worth from the Survey of Consumer Finance. So these are from flow data, these are stock data, and you can see that very much the same pattern, and it's quite explainable where, for example, there's a bigger decline here at older ages than here, what the source of that is, and conceptual differences in the measure. So, if you can imagine, in a young population, you're going to have a lot of working age people here holding few assets, and few old age people here with lots of assets, so the capital labor ratio is going to be lower. In an older population, you're going to have more people in these ages relative to workers, and capital labor ratios are going to be higher, and that's the basic idea that is driving much of what I will be talking about. So, I'm going to assume a Cobb-Douglas production function with constant technology. We can add in technological progress if we want, and then we'd just be looking at variations around a growth path. So here's effective labor, here's effective capital. Alpha I'll take to be 2/3, the coefficient on labor, and 1/3 for capital. That may be a little generous to labor these days, but it's about right. Now, we can project forward effective labor, and we can project forward effective capital, and we can see how their ratio changes. And this is what it looks like in different parts of the world. So say, for Germany and the US, we would have an increase of something like 40% in the capital labor ratio by the end of the century. By, say, 2060 or 2050, if we take a more modest horizon, there's still a considerable increase. But you can also see that for some countries, like Sweden, Austria, and Italy, the increase will be less, more on the order of 20%. And that's reflecting differences in the age pattern of asset holdings in these countries, and also differences in their demographic change, their demographic aging. These are countries that are mostly already rather old. If you look at Latin America, we have countries that are still mostly quite young, but are just on the threshold of experiencing rapid population aging. Some of these countries, like Brazil or Chile or Costa Rica, have fertility that may now have just recently dropped below replacement level, for example. So they have major population aging in their future, and we see major increases, more than doubling projected for Brazil, for example, in capital labor ratios as they age as a consequence. And Mexico and Uruguay are a little lower, but it's still like a 60% increase that is projected. Asia is somewhere in between Europe and Latin America. Somewhat older countries. Japan is, of course, already quite old and much more like Europe, and it will have still some increase over the next 20 years or so, 30 years, but in the long run, not much. Okay, so that gives you some idea. Now, in the Cobb-Douglas model, if we look at, we can differentiate this to get wages and interest rates, and the ratio of wages to interest rates is just proportional to the ratio of capital to labor, and so we can also think of these as projections or simulations of what will happen to the ratio of wages to interest rates, return to labor to return to capital. And so you see really quite large increases that are simulated or projected here because of population aging. I think this happens not in all models of population aging and macroeconomic consequences, but I think it happens in most. The idea that there will be deep, capital deepening, a big increase in capital intensity is not a new or surprising idea, and this is a way of putting some numbers on that through NTA. So this comes both from rising wages and from falling interest rates. And falling interest rates might be an issue for the elderly who often are relying on asset income, and their asset income may drop as a consequence. And falling interest rates may also be an issue for monetary policy and governmental efforts to maintain full employment and so on. And we have a growing literature on secular stagnation as a possible problem as populations age. And this business of falling rates of return as population age is part of that concern with secular stagnation. Okay. Now, we have here a simulation of income, and we also, if we have population size, then we can work out what the implications are for future per capita income, taking into account both the changes in population age distribution and in capital intensity as populations age. And we see that in these developing countries like Mexico, Costa Rica, or Thailand, we have a demographic dividend kind of effect here when we put capital in as well as labor income. In Thailand, we're going to see population aging occurring. Here's the 1.0 line. These are all expressed as indices, indexed on, well, in this case, 2005, usually 2015. In the U.S., we have a very slight increase in per capita income, much of which has happened between 2005 and 2015. Nothing to write home about, as we might say. And in Europe, we see that rising dependency costs of old age are going to dominate capital deepening, and we expect declining per capita income relative to what it otherwise would have been due to population aging. And this isn't extreme by any means. It's on the order of 10% as we move through the 21st century. But I'll come back to this in more detail because this isn't really the sort of outcome we usually look at in NPA. It's not the best measure of, say, welfare outcome that we can construct. A better measure takes into account the way consumption needs or expenditures vary across age. For example, the effect that in the US or Sweden or Germany or UK, older people are consuming a lot more than younger adults and a lot more than children. We want to take that into account too, and we also want to take into account the effect of population aging on the share of output that's set aside for investment. And so we're going to look next instead at this measure, consumption per effective consumer, or aggregate consumption divided by the number of effective consumers. So this is a kind of age-standardized consumption measure. Okay, and this is going to be the dependent variable. I'll be looking at the outcome variable, I think, for the rest of my talk here. Now, it matters when we introduce capital, it matters a lot whether we're thinking about a closed economy in which the capital per worker in an economy just depends on what's happening in that country, or whether we're talking about an open economy in which, if, for example, the capital-labor ratio is rising in some country, and so wage rates are rising and interest rates are falling, well, in that case, owners of assets in that country are going to start investing in other countries. Or if we're in the middle of a demographic transition and the labor force is growing rapidly as a share of the population and there's not that much capital, then we'd imagine in an open economy that capital is flowing in. And the capital-labor ratio, the wage rate, the interest rate are all fixed not by what's happening in an individual country, but on international markets. So we want to distinguish these two cases of an open economy and a closed economy. But at the same time, I want to say that, gee, of course, most economies are at least partially open, but the whole world is going to be aging. And so in a sense, the closed economy simulations I'm going to be showing may be more relevant for the long run than the open economy ones, which are assuming things will more or less remain the way they are now. Okay, so for the closed economy, I developed what is what I call here, this work is partly joint with Andy Mason, I'll say we, the Closed Impact Index, or CII, that shows this outcome for a closed economy, and then the OII shows it for an open economy. That OII is the same as what I was calling the generalized support ratio before. Okay, so the closed economy outcome measure, consumption per effective consumer, it changes over time in this way, where the primes indicate the effect of changing population age distribution. So we have an effect of the savings rate. If the savings rate goes up, then that's going to have a negative effect on, at least in the short term, on consumption per effective consumer, because it means more of output is being set aside for investment rather than consumed. We have an effect of change in the number of effective workers, but we weight it by 2/3 because output depends both on labor and on capital, and both of the capital stock is getting a weight of 1/3, and then we're subtracting off the growth of effective workers. So this measure then is reflecting all of these things as they emerge from NTA profiles and population age distributions. The Open Economy Index has the same underlying model, but here we hold the capital labor ratio fixed and so on. W and R are fixed, and the effect of variations in asset holdings by the domestic population is that either there's an increase in investment abroad, and then there's asset income that flows back to the country from abroad, or other people in other countries are investing in this country and keeping the capital labor ratio up where it would be in an international context, and then a part of the output is flowing back in returns to other countries. So those are the two forms of models with capital that I'm going to be looking at. And here we have simulations over the future for 9 countries. And the SR is the support ratio. That's this dark blue line. The closed assumptions about the future fertility trajectory on the simulated outcome. First under the closed economy case assumption, and then for all 3. So we'll end up by looking at the interaction of fertility change with our method of assessment, whether we're assuming open or closed or support ratio or whatever. Here we're using the UN fertility variance to look at the effect of having somewhat higher fertility versus somewhat lower fertility as we move through the century. Now the UN fertility variants are essentially, they have a high variant, which is the total fertility rate is a half child higher, and a low fertility variant in which it's a half child lower. These are phased in over the course of maybe 15 or 20 years, something like that. And to make this a little more specific, I should say, in their medium projection, the UN is assuming that most low fertility countries have some fertility increase as we move through the century. Certainly that's true for the European countries. So in the medium forecast, many of these countries, like Austria, Germany, would be moving towards a total fertility rate of 1.75. Under the low fertility assumption, they'll instead be moving to 1.25. For many countries, it's not so different than assuming that fertility stays low rather than rebounding in the way that the UN medium projection suggests. So, lower fertility brings better outcomes in some ways. It reduces child dependency. That's the first effect it has, but this is an effect that lasts for many decades. Eventually, of course, it's going to lead to higher old age dependency, but in the medium term, the short term and the medium term, it's leading to reduced child dependency. It also raises capital intensity because the labor supply then grows more slowly, and therefore it raises wages relative to interest rates. Long run, deeper aging is going to be costly. Okay, so let's, this is, what, 24 countries here, but let me pull a few out to look at more closely. So here, remember, we're looking at the closed economy case, and the medium fertility is the red, the low is the blue, the high is the gray. And so for these developing countries, they're all doing much better with lower fertility than the medium UN projection. Well, it's clear looking at that. But these are countries that have not really low fertility, but moderate fertility, or even highish fertility, as in the Philippines. More surprising is that even in some low fertility countries, like Austria or Taiwan or Spain or Chile, it turns out that low fertility could be beneficial, and that this last stage of deeper population aging isn't necessarily decisive. So in Austria here, you see, comparing the low fertility simulation to the medium one, you see this period in which child dependency is lower, and so consumption per equivalent consumer is higher, and then that really never really drops below the high fertility assumption, or even barely below the medium. And for Spain, this is even clearer. Taiwan, more so. Chile, somewhat similar. So I found this surprising, and it's certainly something to discuss. What can that mean? But there are other low fertility countries like Hungary, Germany, El Salvador, Japan. These are countries that already have fairly low fertility, and in these countries you can see that the low fertility simulation is dropping well below in Hungary. It's dropping below, but just slightly in Germany. It's dropping below in Japan, and it's dropping well below in El Salvador. So you get both of these kinds of outcomes depending on details in countries. I would conclude from this that, at least under the assumptions I'm using here, if countries already have quite low fertility today, it doesn't seem to make a great deal of difference whether fertility is a half-child higher or a half-child lower. If you look at Austria, I'd say that's true. In the long term, in the medium term, there are these advantages to having lower fertility, but in the long term, it doesn't really make a lot of difference. Okay. Now, for the last point, I want to look at both closed versus open versus support ratio and high fertility versus low fertility. And I'm going to do that by expressing the effects of low or high fertility as ratios of the medium projection for each of these different approaches. And okay, there are 24 countries, but let's pull some out. And in fact, these all look quite similar. So I'll just look at two of these. So Germany is quite typical. And if we look at the effect of low fertility on the support ratio, well, you have this gain because of reduced child dependency. But then after whatever this is, maybe 2050 or something like that, the support ratio comes to, the rising old age dependency comes to dominate any advantages of capital. Well, there isn't capital intensification taken into account here. So you just see the dependency effects. On the other hand, if you look at the closed index that includes capital, now the effect of rising old age dependency is quite muted after whatever that as 2065 may be, and you end up not doing so badly in the long run, and you still have these medium-term gains. And the open index, as is always the case in all of these on the right, is somewhere in between, generally closer to the closed index, but it's partway in between those two. So this is a typical outcome. And, okay. If we look at Mexico, it's a similar story, but there are bigger advantages in the capital models to reducing fertility. So even in the very long run, capital intensification is continuing to dominate increased aging. All right. So let me conclude now, first of all, with some limitations. I should say, first of all, nothing in this takes account in any way of what satisfaction parents may get from children. So it's not really a welfare analysis in any way. It's just looking at, or trying to look at effects on other forms of consumption. Some economists think that rising public debt is going to crowd out capital, and they won't be surprised if capital intensity drops. As I said before, there are lots of different ways of modeling capital accumulation and savings, and perhaps some of those would lead to quite different results, although I think most do show this kind of capital intensification I've been talking about. I mentioned the fact, I think global population aging is going to cause capital intensification under the open economy scenario as well. It would be interesting to do all this in a more global context. And then, very important, as I started out saying, this is a kind of meta-analysis, because it's saying, well, suppose an economy successfully addresses all the problems of policy and institution and coming up with technologies to use more capital-intensive technologies for production and elder care and so on and so forth. What would we then be left with? Well, those are all very real problems that have to be addressed. I've just assumed them away. I haven't taken into account human capital or the time costs associated with population aging. I think doing so just reinforces the conclusions I have here. And finally, as I said before, behavior is already changing in ways that alter the NTA profiles on which this analysis is based. For example, rising age and retirement. So the world may look quite different in 10 years than it does now. So those are limitations, but setting those aside for the moment, it looks like capital intensity is going to rise in virtually all countries, and wages are going to rise relative to interest rates and so on, if we accept this analysis. Taking capital into account suggests greater benefits from reducing fertility in both developing and rich countries. Lower fertility boosts consumption for all 25 countries by all measures, at least for the first 40 years. This is just the, let's say, perhaps temporary effect of improving child dependency ratios. At the same time, higher fertility is costly, which raises questions about pronatalist policies. In many countries, we saw that low versus high fertility seems to make little difference in the long run. And I think maybe these are countries that are going to be in this optimal fertility range that was identified in the NTA paper in Science a few years ago, which in comparative steady states suggested there was a range of maybe a half child or so, or one child, over which it didn't make a whole lot of difference. In some ways, that analysis was quite a bit like this, but steady state. Okay, so the bottom line is that population aging is going to present many challenges, but the overall picture, I think, is encouraging and not cause an alarm, except that there are all these policy issues and adjustments to be made in order for something like this macro picture to emerge. Thank you.
Many thanks.
So thank you, Ron, for this nice presentation. Just, there is a very important assumption, this decreasing return to capital, that you make. And you know that capital deepening, due to demography, is highly linked to this kind of Cobb-Douglas function. What about if you think about other function with like increasing return, to scale? And you could exactly have the opposite, and then you have a scale effect, and then pro-natalist policy could foster growth, and you start with a setting which is counterfactual in terms of convergence, in terms of sustainable growth. So I would like to have your view on this.
So may I suggest whoever asks a question just gives his name, and I can say, no, this was just an idea now. Hippolyte Alpi is the representative of the French team in the agenda. And this was clearly a very methodological question. So, next one.
Yes, my name is Tetsuya Fukuda. I'm from Japan. So, I wanted to ask you how the aspect of population decline affect your conclusion, because Japan is facing not only population aging but also population decline. So that it's very costly to rise fertility, but we somehow have to deal with it. And I guess you don't really touch the topic of population decline as a consequence of population aging. So I want to know how you think about it.
Okay, so first, Hippolyte, I suppose if I were going to look at increasing returns of some sort, I would look at the Chad Jones type models or something like that, and I'm not sure. I imagine, as you say, it would just completely change everything if you think that more rapid population growth is going to lead to more rapid technological progress, and then you're off and running. So I'd say it's not. It would have a similar effect to increasing returns, but maybe through a different channel. And in any event, even more modest changes in the production function, so something a little moving a bit beyond Cobb-Douglas would surely be interesting to look at. I think of the, and I think that's a next step. I haven't gotten there. I think of the endogenous growth models as very interesting, but I don't. My sense is the evidentiary basis is kind of sort of empirical evidence is not very clear. So, yeah, I'm not. I enjoy reading them and so on, but I wouldn't want to give advice based on them. So. Now, for Japan and declining population, and other countries in Europe with declining population, in this kind of analysis, it's all good, It just means you don't have to save so much, and or for a given savings rate, you're going to have more capital per worker, or you'll be able to invest more overseas, or something of that sort. And so if there may be other kinds of concerns about a declining population. People feel bad, I think, when their national population is declining. It looks as if they're going out of business in some ways as a country. Well, those would be concerns that would be outside of this analysis and something else you'd want to take into account. And if fertility is so low because young people feel so discouraged by economic prospects, it's a bad thing. That's not in this analysis anywhere. This is just taking the fertility as sort of given and with no consequences in itself for well-being. So I don't know if that really answers your question. yeah, declining population, it's going to be very old, and I think there's going to be a lot of capital, and there may be an issue trying to find a place where to invest it, and all of those kinds of things.
So maybe let's have a second round. So I see one question here. Maybe you introduce yourself, and another question in the back.
Katerina Lysenkova, Fraser Lander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. I understand that the way you set up the model is that you are assuming that this new social contract is achieved by some means, and the workers are paying these contributions to be able to sustain their old age high-level consumption, and that the cross-sectional profiles are staying fixed. But this means that the cohort profiles are going down for developed countries. Do I understand this correct?
Yeah.
So this just kind of creates the challenge. How do you persuade the working age population to sustain the high consumption of the old people if their own consumption is going down over time relative to the people who they're supporting?
Well, I mean,
Maybe it's
yes,
here,
right,
one
right.
more, and then
Rainer Buchecker, University of Linz. I've just two precise questions. Question one, capital is internationally mobile in your model, labor is not. How does this square with migration movements? Second question, Africa is non-existent?
okay. Can I ask, because I think that's the final round of questions, and is there any further question, comment, or do you see any hand? No? Okay, then maybe we have a final reply by Ron, and then of course you're available also during the breaks.
yeah, good questions. Now, on the social contract and long-run declining consumption, first of all, this would be relative to whatever underlying trend there might be from productivity growth, and we hope there would be some that it wouldn't be absolutely declining. But within that, different societies, I think, will share the cost of population aging in different ways. Personally, I think it should be shared across all generations, although that's not the way the politics usually plays out. I think the German system has tried to implement kind of cross-generational sharing where benefits can go down as well as taxes going up. So I think there can be sharing of that sort, but I don't think anyone's going to be happy with these long-run effects, but they're relatively modest in what comes up here compared to what comes up if you're just looking at the old age dependency without these deepening effects. Now, Africa, so we have now a growing number of, where did that go? Growing number of African countries in NTA, but in most of them we're still sort of working on trying to get we have the basic labor and consumption profiles, but and we generally have public transfers, but we don't have private transfers quite right, and there are various issues with it, the asset income data and so on. So the only African country that was actually shown there was South Africa, and it is there, and I hope that in a year or two we will have more. The main African countries, so far the most detailed accounts are for Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Ghana, I think. There are many in Central and West Africa now that have been doing it, and Botswana, I think, is joining the project, and so on. So I hope to be able to say more about that later. Mobile labor, yeah, great question, and I haven't really thought, every once in a while that pops into my mind, and I haven't really thought through exactly how, I don't know exactly how to deal with that. Of course, I guess it's just another version of saying, well, you could really look at this in the global closed economy model. If you could take the assumption of perfectly frictionless, you know, yeah, it would be a difficult thing to implement. Of course, the UN projections are including the amount of migration that they are projecting. I guess that's what I should have started out by saying. But that's not really integrated in the theoretical context beyond the fact that these projections include assumed migration.